Buddy, hello, hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our special edition of our regular Ask a Psychedelic Scientist. This week, we're joined by the world famous Dr. Dennis McKenna. So we're really excited to have Dennis as our special guest this week. So first, just want to welcome you all. Thank you all for joining our events. This is a really great turnout. We're very excited about the enthusiasm, no doubt, to ask Dennis McKenna questions and get to see him answer those questions. Or
not.
But we have a really great lineup of questions going. So the way that this is going to work today is we're going to have just a series of question and answers for Dennis. And so anyone that wants to ask a question for Dennis, please just go ahead and type that into the chat box that if you see on the bottom menu of Zoom, you'll see a little like text box thing. So if you click that, it'll open up a chat box and you can type your questions, and we'll be fielding questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can today within the 2-hour period that we have Dennis on Zoom. And like I said, any question is fair game except for anything about how to source or find any illegal substances. So this is being run by the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. My name is Jessica Nielson. I'm one of the founders of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. And, you know, we want to be an above ground organization where we're doing everything by the book and trying to work to legalize and decriminalize psychedelics for scientific research and therapeutic and spiritual uses. And therefore, we want to make sure that we're keeping everything we do above ground and legal. So to that end, you know, we're happy to provide education and resources for various aspects and a harm reduction around psychedelics and psychedelic experiences. But we don't want to do anything that puts anybody in legal harm. Or psychological harm for that matter. So with that, we'll open this up, and I just want to introduce our special guest, who probably needs no introduction, but his name is Dr. Dennis McKenna. Some of you may know him as the younger brother of the famous Terence McKenna. He's been a psychedelic researcher for a very, very long time. He specializes in ethnobotany, and he has done a lot of research in the field of ayahuasca and plant medicines. And the field of psychedelic research is very much blessed to have Dennis as one of our guiding lights and elders in the community that's really helped lay a really good foundation for psychedelic science. And as a bonus, I've known Dennis for quite a long time as being a fellow psychedelic researcher, particularly in the ayahuasca space. And so when I made the decision to move to Minnesota from California, I used to live in San Francisco, that was sort of one of the things that convinced me to come here, was knowing that Dennis McKenna lived in Minneapolis. So it must be a pretty rad place. So to that, I'll turn it over to Dennis, and he'll just give a brief little introduction, and then we'll go ahead and start with the question and answer. So welcome, Dennis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and everybody who's supporting this. Thanks. I know that a lot of work goes into staging these events, so thank you for all your efforts, and thank you very much, Jessica, for the warm invitation. It's great to reconnect with my friends in Minnesota. I see some of them on this list are not in Minnesota, but that's okay too. Yes, I left Minnesota about a year ago. Actually, in March 2019, I moved to British Columbia. But I miss all my friends in Minnesota, especially those in the Minneapolis Psychedelic Society. So it's nice to reconnect with everyone. And I hope we don't bore you to tears in this 2 hours or whatever it is, but I'm sure you have good questions. So there'll be plenty to talk about. I'm happy to be here.
Oops, I was muted. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dennis. Okay, so I guess to follow up with that, I guess I'll start with this first question that comes from someone in our local community. What is the one thing you miss most about Minnesota?
The one thing I miss most about Minnesota, well, it's not the snow and the cold, I can tell you that. It's my friends. You know, I had a wonderful circle of friends within and without the psychedelic community. Fortunately, the technologies that we have let us keep in touch, but it's not the same, you know, as being able to actually physically meet and so on. But yes, I miss my friends a lot. So
continue.
Well, thank you. I'm sure, I know I miss you. I know a bunch of us miss you. So, but at least we have Zoom. So let's see, the next question. What is your version of enlightenment?
what is my version of
right.
enlightenment?
Right.
Yeah.
I thought these were supposed to be easy questions. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's an answer to that or a short answer. I'm kind of a Taoist by inclination, and I think enlightenment is a state of being in harmony with yourself and with nature. I guess that's how I define it, and your loved ones. Enlightenment is all about being in harmony, and being at peace, and that's what we seek. I think there's a Zen cone of some kind. You've probably all heard of it. What do we do before enlightenment? Chop wood, draw water. What do we do after enlightenment? Chop wood, draw water. And the implication is that you do the same things, you just live your life, but your perspective may be changed. And as we know, since we're all psychedelic people, we understand how that works.
Okay, great. Thank you for taking a tackle at that. What is your vision for the future of psychedelics?
Boy, I don't know. My vision for the future, I think everybody is kind of tracking this, what seems to be emerging, all these startup companies that want to commercialize psychedelics and turn them into pharmaceuticals and integrate them into biomedicine, which I don't have a problem with. In general, I like to support research. I would like to see psychedelics integrated into biomedicine. But at the same time, I don't think you can do that without actually revolutionizing medicine or at least psychiatry. The other side of it is, I think it's important to remember that psychedelics, unlike any other medicine that's ever come into general use in medicine, they emerge out of a unique context, which is the cultural, historical, and indigenous context. These things are sacred medicines in many societies. And I think there's a danger that in the rush to develop something like psilocybin, for example, into a pharmaceutical, we risk possibly forgetting where these things came from. And I think it's important to remember that connection, because these medicines, as I've often said, they are medicines for the soul, but not only the collective soul, they're medicines or the individual soul, they're medicines for the collective soul, and possibly medicines to heal our relationship with nature. And I think it's important to honor the indigenous roots, sometimes literally the indigenous roots of these medicines, and try to maintain that connection. So I support research, and I would like to see these medicines, accepted into therapeutic practice in medicine, but I think that should not be done at the risk of forgetting their origins or making natural psychedelics inaccessible to people. What I don't want to see is a situation where someone can go to a clinic and pay $30,000 or so if they can afford it and have a clinical study with psilocybin, while another person who may not be able to afford that or may not be inclined to that would get arrested for going out into the woods and picking mushrooms. you know, this seems like a disjunct that doesn't seem right. So I am encouraged by the decriminalization movements in various municipalities. I don't know if Minneapolis has one of those underway yet. Do they, Jessica, or are they working toward that in Minneapolis?
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
few of us. We've met with city council a couple times, and yep.
It seems that decriminalization, which shouldn't even be necessary, you know, because these things should never have been declared criminals. You can't criminalize a plant or a fungus. That's ridiculous. But it seems that this is happening on the community level rather than on the state level. I think the psilocybin initiative in California just did not get enough signatures for the ballot this year. So it's happening on the municipal level. It's happening on the community level, and that's a good thing. I think that's the way it should happen. I look forward to the day when there can be a psychedelic centers in many communities across the country that are operating legally, out in the open, without any legal, not breaking any prohibition laws. And it can be a community resource, and it can provide more than simply psychedelic experiences. It can provide the therapeutic experiences, but it can also be more holistic. It can provide a range of spiritual practices, even, you know, counseling on things like nutrition. It can be a place where families can come and really function as a resource without, you know, where psychedelics are part of it, part of what such a center provides, but not necessarily the sole focus or the only focus, even the central focus. They need to be integrated into a broader program, which is about, put very simply, learning to be better people, learning to be better men and women, and learning to respect nature and acknowledging the gift that these psychedelic medicines have. Indigenously, they are called plant teachers, and we have a lot to learn from them. We should be free to learn from them in sets and settings that are supportive of that, you know, and certainly not under any prohibition. So that's, you know, I could say more, but I'm not one for the short answers, you might have known. But anyway, that's what I say to that.
Thank you. That was a really great response. We'll probably shift gears a bit and ask something maybe a little bit more related to your doctoral research. Do plants make psychedelics as a defense mechanism against bugs?
Well, no, it's not that simple. Some plants may make these substances as defense mechanisms against bugs, bacteria, you know, animals that might want to nibble on them. But plants and fungi, they make a vast array of chemical compounds which serve multiple functions. And they're not all psychoactive compounds. It's just that some of them happen to resemble neurotransmitters. So, you know, when we consume them, or any mammal consumes them, you get an effect. And but these messenger molecules, that the plants and the fungi that make them don't do it out of exuberance. They actually have a purpose. And the purpose is that plants speak chemistry. Plants use these chemical messengers to optimize their relationships with everything in the environment. They can't run away. You know, they don't actually have behavior in that sense. They communicate via these signal transduction molecules. Some of them are repellents, some of them, and it gets more interesting when some of them, when the message is not stay away, but come closer. In other words, let's initiate symbiosis. Let's initiate a relationship. And in these symbiotic relationships, this is all mediated through chemical transduction processes. So the message might be, let's form an alliance that is mutually beneficial. And this goes on all the time. You know, we think of it as something special when we're talking about psychedelics or psychoactives, but anything we find useful about a plant, it may be a nutritional property, a color, maybe just its aesthetic beauty. All of those things are bases to form symbiotic relationships with other organisms. And that is how plants optimize their relationships with everything in the environment. So it, you know, if you look at something like psilocybin, and often these secondary compounds are purposed to multiple applications. If you look at something like psilocybin, if you're an insect, it might be a repellent. You know, psilocybin might be sending the message, stay away. If you happen to be a curious primate, the message, and consume one of these mushrooms, accidentally or deliberately, the message is very much about come closer. You know, let's learn from each other. Let's form a symbiotic relationship. So it's a complex set. The plants and the fungi are very creative in terms of the molecules that they can make. And then they use those same molecules for multiple purposes, depending on what their targets are, what organisms are being messaged in this situation. So the answer is yes and no. Sometimes they are repellents, but more often they have a more complex role.
All right, thank you. So I guess maybe along those lines, but maybe more of a philosophical question. Okay. Why do you think dimethyltryptamine exists? Because, you know, we know that we have it in our brains, it's in all these psychoactive plants that have been used to expand consciousness. So what is the function of dimethyltryptamine in nature?
The function is to ask questions like this that can't really be answered. So dimethyltryptamine is a good example of one of these messenger molecules that plants make, and animals and fungi. So dimethyltryptamine it's derived from tryptophan, which is an amino acid universally found in all organisms. It's one of the 20 amino acids that goes into protein. So every living thing on the planet, as far as we know, contains tryptophan. Tryptophan can be converted to dimethyltryptamine in two very trivial steps. The removal of the carboxylic acid group of tryptophan gives you tryptamine. And then from tryptamine, it branches out into various pathways. These are all enzymatic reactions. In cells, there are so-called aromatic amino acid decarboxylases. That's the technical term. I love biochemistry because often the terms tell you what it does. And in this case, it removes the carboxylic acid group from an aromatic amino acid. And then along come another set of enzymes called N-methyltransferases that describes what they do. They stick methyl groups on nitrogen. So in this case, they stick methyl groups on the nitrogen of tryptamine, and you have dimethyltryptamine in two trivial steps. So because DMT is so close to what we call primary metabolism, it doesn't occur in every organism, but it probably occurs to some degree in almost all plants. It's very, very common in plants because it's only two steps away from tryptophan. And it's in most plants, it's probably there, but at very low levels. But then certain plants, the ones that we have discovered accidentally or otherwise, it probably overexpresses DMT. And then, and then we discover that. But DMT is, of all the psychedelics, is it's kind of unique in some ways because it's not orally active. So if you can make tea or eat a plant made of that contains DMT all day long, nothing will happen unless you combine it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Monoamine oxidase being the enzyme in the gut that inactivates DMT and prevents it from ever making it into the circulatory system in an intact form. So MAO inhibitors will prevent that reaction and allow it to become orally absorbed and active. And that's the basis of the pharmacology of ayahuasca. Why is it there? This is not a chemical question. It's there because, I mean, I think there's no profound philosophical reason for it. It's just that tryptophan happens to be the precursor, and their enzymes, these key enzymes in the synthesis, they have other purposes as well. They're very much part of cellular housekeeping, if you will. Decarboxylases and methyltransferases are common enzymes in almost any cellular system. So it's a biochemical accident in some ways that dimethyltryptamine is there. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting that that you think it's an accident. Could be.
Well, it's an accident. I don't think there's. I mean, I think nature designs itself, you know, and I think that, I mean, dimethyltryptamine in plants existed long before there were primates or humans to consume these preparations. Same with psilocybin. You know, I just had an interview with Merlin Sheldrake a couple of days ago. He's written a wonderful book called Entangled Life about fungi. It's about to come out in the middle of May. How fungi change our world, transform our spirit, etc., etc. Anyway, I forget the exact title, but have a look on Amazon or whatever. Definitely recommend this book. But we were having a conversation. Psilocybin probably appeared in mushrooms 75 million years ago. So it wasn't synthesized by fungi for humans, you know, but when humans came along, then it became, you know, then its function became important because it became the basis of these symbiotic relationships. It was the reason that we were interested in the psychedelic mushrooms, but it was around for a long time before that. And it probably was, as we were discussing, either a repellent for insects or possibly a lure for insects. There are all sorts of peculiar relationships between psilocybin mushrooms and insects, like cicadas, for example. So it's another one of these messenger molecules that is adapted to multiple functions depending on what the interaction is. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that.
Okay.
Curious and sort of inspired by one of the questions I saw come through about kind of the phylogenetic tree of how these things developed, and maybe like, you know, did plants have DMT first, or you know, kind of where on the evolutionary, you know, branching points did these things kind of get incorporated into the various species that have them? Like, do you think plants had them first or animals had them first?
Well, yeah, so it's possible that, it's possible, though unlikely. I mean, DMT could have evolved from, you know, on different occasions. It wasn't necessarily one event that led to DMT. Like I was talking with Merlin about this. Psilocybin was probably invented, if you want to put it that way, by nature more than once, you know, because it shows up in different parts of the fungal kingdom where you wouldn't expect it to. And psilocybin is quite interesting because, well, we know that it's intrinsically interesting, but one of the aspects of it in terms of phylogeny is it showed up in different species and phyla of fungi through horizontal gene transfer, which is an interesting thing. In bacteria, horizontal gene transfer is very common. It's not so common in fungi, but in fact, with psilocybin, that does occur. In other words, this entire gene complex, the multiple genes that it takes to make psilocybin from tryptophan, have been transferred from one fungus species to another without any sexual interaction or sexual exchange of genes. It's an asexual genetic transmission mechanism. And that's very interesting that that goes on. And it also tells us, you know, organisms don't waste time doing this kind of thing because it takes time and energy. So the fact that this has been transmitted so many times by fungal, horizontal gene transfer suggests that it's important. You know, whatever it does, it's important. And but we don't know exactly what it does. I mean, it may have it. We know what it does to us. We have some idea of what it does to insects under certain conditions. Some people have suggested, well, the purpose of psilocybin was to drive insects crazy. You know, so they lost their way. They couldn't find their way back to their nests and so on. And so in that sense, it was a protective mechanism. Other people have suggested, well, it was actually a lure to the insect, and maybe they're tripping too. You know, they may enjoy the effects of psilocybin. They have serotonin receptors, they have nervous systems and all that. Who knows what an insect might experience, you know, from eating mushrooms, feeding on mushrooms. What does it do for the mushroom? Well, obviously, spore dispersal. You know, mushrooms, the mushroom that we see that comes up out of the ground, that's just a part of the fungus. Most of the fungus is underground as a network of mycelium. The actual mushroom is the reproductive body. It's like a fruit on a tree. That's the part you see. They are evolved to be consumed. You know, both mushrooms and fruits are usually evolved to be consumed because that's part of their seed or spore dispersal strategy. And no doubt, insects that feed on psilocybin mushrooms or any mushrooms are involved in spore distribution. So that's a big agenda for fungi. They want to reproduce. They want to spread, like any other organism. So psilocybin may be a molecule that helps them do that.
That's okay, cool. Thanks for answering all that. I guess it's kind of a follow-up. I just saw this question come in the chat, and it seems somewhat related. So I don't know if you're familiar that, like, I guess the government declassified a bunch of videos. So now they release these UFO videos. So we might think aliens do exist, and they have been lying about it or whatever. And so the question comes, because a lot of people have talked about this, about whether things like psychedelics or mushrooms or whatever came to us and they're actually alien in nature, or maybe DMT itself is alien in nature. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on it. I can't comment on the UFO, you know, the recently released UFO video. I mean, it looks interesting. They're definitely detecting something. I think we have to be very careful to leap to the conclusion that these are alien spacecraft. You know, the answer is to that, we don't know what they are. You know, what we do know is that occurred and it was recorded. The notion that, you know, which my brother propagated, and I don't know how serious he was about it, but the short answer, are mushrooms extraterrestrial or psilocybin mushrooms specifically extraterrestrial? The answer is no. Sadly, I'm afraid not. And the reason for this is that the reason we can say that with confidence is mushrooms are very much integrated into earthly life. You know, their phylogeny is well described, well established, and they are. If you wanted to make the case that psilocybin was extraterrestrial, what are you going to say about all the other psychedelics that are out there? And also psilocybin, if you want to make that case, then you have to make the case that tryptophan, which all these things come from, the amino acid, you have to make the case that tryptophan was actually the extraterrestrial molecule, you know, that was somehow seeded into the biosphere 3.84 billion years ago. You know, you could make that case, but it would be very hard to prove it. And there's no reason to prove it, because we know that the earthly, you know, the earthly biome, if you will, is perfectly capable of making a simple compound like DMT or psilocybin. So inevitably, something like that is going to show up, you know, and things like that will show up, and then it turns out they're useful to the organisms that make it for whatever purposes. They're repellents, they're lures, they're you know, signals to primates that they should be consumed. You know, you just can't make the case that psilocybin or the genes in psilocybes have an extraterrestrial origin. I'm sorry, you can't do it. They're not extraterrestrial messengers. They are terrestrial messengers. You know, and they do have a message for our species, but it didn't come from another galaxy. It came from Mother Gaia, if you want to think of it that way.
Well, great. Well, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, sorry to burst any bubbles, but you know, you just can't make the case from a biochemical point of view.
Well, this is Psychedelic Scientist. Ask a Psychedelic Scientist. So we'll keep things testable and having empirical evidence. So the next question is from another one of our awesome local elders. His question is pardon me if I don't pronounce this correctly, the Huichol and Mazatec and Amazonian peoples all had unique healing narratives and practices that fit their culture. Do we as a culture have something similar to that?
I think we're in the process of developing it. You know, as psychedelics get more integrated into our society, we're borrowing heavily from indigenous traditions, which I think is okay. But I think it's important to remember that we're not indigenous, and you know, we can borrow some of these practices, but it will never be the same. I think our society, psychedelics have been a part of society, well, for a long time, but even since they were prohibited, supposedly, around the end of the 60s, they didn't go away. People continue to use them. And I think in the decades since and before, I think we're in the process of developing our own myths and our own cultural practices around psychedelics. I think, and so we're in the place where we can essentially create a hybrid of what you find in traditional cultures and what goes on in clinical practices, bring these things together and create a new paradigm that borrows from the best of indigenous traditional medicine and the best of modern psychotherapeutic medicine, and bring them together in something that is neither one, you know, that is the sort of the natural evolution of the fusion of these two different approaches. So I think that's our challenge, to learn how to integrate these into society. And it's happening. It's not officially sanctioned, but there are people around and who have used these substances for a long time, and they have learned a thing or two. They've learned how to use these things. So that knowledge is being disseminated. And I think we are inventing new paradigms. And that has to go on if we're going to be able to integrate psychedelics into our society. Because one thing about psychedelics that differentiates it from, again, almost all other medicines is that the actual experience is the therapeutic effect. So many drugs are not psychoactive. You take them and presumably they do what they do. But in order to use psychedelics, you have to have a set and setting that's appropriate. And the challenge is really to develop these set and settings that work for whatever the goal is, whether it's a therapeutic outcome or simply learning or psychospiritual development or even a good time. I mean, you can get all these things from the psychedelic, and it depends on how you structure the set, which is your mindset, really, what you bring to the table, and then the setting, which needs to be appropriate for whatever you're doing. There are certain settings that are obviously not appropriate. Taking them on the freeway at 70 miles an hour, probably not a good idea. But apart from that, there are many, many settings that could work for many different circumstances. So this is something, we've had this, as a species, we've had this co-evolutionary relationship with psychedelics for a long time. As a modern 21st century culture, we're discovering and in some ways making up the practices that work for us in terms of using psilocybin or other psychedelics in a therapeutic way or a mind expanding way or whatever. It's an ongoing process that's going on.
All right, great. Thanks for sharing that. Let's see. This question's a little bit more about kind of society and maybe some of the internal dialogues that are happening within the psychedelic community. So do you think there's any risk that the psychedelic community may fracture due to dogmas that could develop around different interpretations of how to deal with mystical experiences or spiritual emergencies?
Well, yes, I think there's always that risk. Psychedelics do not necessarily have to be used in a religious context or even a ritual context, although ritual usually helps. Ritual is part of orchestrating that setting dynamic that is so important. Psychedelics are also extremely powerful spiritual technologies, and anytime you have something like that, and there is the potential for it to be abused. Some people will see the use of that as a road to power and dominance, and quite apart from psychedelics, we know that in religion in general, there is a risk of people who are motivated to power to take that powerful technology and then use it to manipulate other people. I think this is a danger with psychedelics. They can certainly be misused in that way. All we have to do is think about, Charles Manson and his bunch. That was a classic example of a sociopath, a maniac, using psychedelics to manipulate people and control their behavior. In South America, we see all of these religions, well, not all of them, there are not that many. There are basically three main religions in South America that use psychedelics use ayahuasca specifically as a sacrament. And most of them are very benign religions. There's nothing wrong with that. If you choose to use that medicine in that context, that's fine. But if you look back at the history of these sects, these cults, which haven't been around so long, there have been schisms, there have been splits. People will, a particular practitioner, a priest, if you will decide to split off and form their own subcult and all that. And this is not unique to psychedelics. This is what religions do. Schism in religions is, a very common thing. All you have to do is look at the history of Christianity. all of these religions originally branched off from Catholicism, and now there are many, and that's all a result of people not being happy with the establishment, so then they want to establish something, something alternative that's more suited to their tastes. You're at risk of this for psychedelics, and there's no way to stop it. And actually, in some ways, I think it's a good thing. The thing is, you have to be clear about your motivations for using it, and it's important to, I don't know, there is a risk, how to put it, people are interested in psychedelics because they lack in meaning in their lives. Basically, we are a culture that makes it very difficult to have a genuine spiritual or mystical experience. People long to have meaningful experiences. Psychedelics are one of the tools that may enable people to have those experiences. And so that longing should be encouraged, because these days established religion, is not really providing that. If it was, people wouldn't have to look outside that for something else. So religion is not providing the spiritual answers that people need. So people look outside for something like psychedelics. And that's a natural human impulse, but then it also leads into the temptation to just accept a dogma, or accept, to join a cult and pretty much accept whatever they tell you. And I think that's a danger, because psychedelics are, in some ways, they're a tool for learning how to think for ourselves. And if you look at the whole sort of sad and sordid history of cults, the message is often, you don't have to think anymore, just accept what we tell you and follow us. And hopefully psychedelics can be an antidote to that. Again, I guess I've wandered off into the weeds here, but that's generally what I think.
No, I think that's an interesting perspective. To follow up on that, I'm curious if you think that psychedelics themselves have any inherent cult-like properties to them, if they could get people to be more predisposed to groupthink. It seems like when people are kind of early on in their psychedelic exploration, psychedelics is like so amazing, and they're so wrapped up in it that it kind of can seem like its own cult type thing, and people are so just enraptured by it. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, it's because of what they do is so interesting to people and so appealing to people, and then they want to get involved, and they want to, they want to find the others. They want to find people of like mind who are involved in psychedelics. Like, they may join a cult that uses psychedelics. Maybe they'll join the Minneapolis Psychedelic Society, which I wouldn't call a cult. Maybe it is. I don't think so. It's more of an educational organization. But the important thing to remember, there's nothing intrinsic in the drugs about this. The drugs simply have the properties that they have. And they are morally neutral. I sometimes say there's no such thing as a bad drug, but there are plenty of bad ways to use drugs, whatever they are. Psychedelics or whatever, there are lots of bad ways to use drugs, but drug use is an aspect of human behavior. And in human behavior is where the moral dimension emerges. If something is good or evil, it's a reflection of human behavior. Things don't have moral properties, in my opinion. There's not some inherent evil, for example, in a compound like cocaine. Cocaine is a molecule. It has certain pharmacological properties. In some cases, they're quite beneficial. In other cases, and in most cases probably, when you take pure cocaine, it's, there's the potential to harm yourself, get addicted or otherwise harm yourself. But the drug is the same no matter what, always. It's the circumstances and the choices you make in how you choose to use these substances. And that's the crux, in my opinion. That's to coming to terms with these compounds. And we have to learn, the problem with most drug education programs, so-called drug education, as taught in school, is all about, the message is, don't use drugs. It's all about avoidance in consuming any drug. Well, that's not really practical, because people are going to use drugs. So, and sometimes they won't even know what drugs that they are using as drugs. Most of us don't think of things like coffee and chocolate and so on as drugs, but they are in fact drugs. And so the message that should come from drug education programs is to teach people how to use drugs, not to use them. And so the first thing you say is, well, if you choose not to use drugs, well, for one thing, good luck, because you won't be able to actually not use drugs. We're made of drugs. But the message from real drug education would be to teach people how to make appropriate choices in terms of which drugs they want to take into their bodies, why are they doing it, what are they hoping to get out of it? In other words, what's the behavioral rationale for doing this? Teach people how to properly use drugs. But of course, it's heresy to say, oh, we should teach kids how to use drugs. In fact, that's exactly what we should be doing. And teach them how to use them, if they're going to use them, in a way that maximizes the benefit and minimizes the harm. That's all we're saying.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I know one of the questions in the chat was wondering about, psychedelic use in family situations, and I know that, especially when it's part of the culture, like with ayahuasca, where they'll give younger folks and sometimes kids ayahuasca. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that, what we're trying to do here with the Psychedelic Society is really create a society built around our engagement in a responsible way with psychedelics for our own wellness and spirituality. And I guess to build upon that for the next question, as psychedelics become more accessible, such as being decriminalized or even legalized for therapeutic uses, how do you think society and religion will respond to this democratization of direct access to mystical experiences?
Well, I think religion, at least the organized Abrahamic religions, may not be too happy about that. Because it always traditionally it's always been the priesthood. It's this hierarchical system. You're not supposed to talk to God directly. We'll do that. We'll tell you what he said. Putting it in a simplistic way. In other words, they have arrogated to themselves the authority to transmit the spiritual message. And psychedelics short circuit all that. You can go directly to the source, whatever it is, and get your mystical experience. So religion is pretty much, especially in the Western world, and especially in the, really, it's always been sort of an authoritarian institution, and it's seen itself as an institution charged with telling people how to behave and also telling people how to think. And so psychedelics, which encourage you to think for yourself, are definitely a threat to these institutions. And they're threats to other institutions too, who view their role as propagating a message and basically discouraging people from questioning it and thinking for themselves. Psychedelics are quite the opposite. They teach you, they open your mind, and they give you the tools to think for yourself. Terence said, and I have said on occasion, and I think it's true, at the end of the 60s, psychedelics had to be prohibited. Psychedelics are dangerous, he said, because they give you dangerous ideas. It's not that the drugs themselves are dangerous. The ideas that they stimulate are dangerous to the established order. And we saw this in the 60s, and we see it now in a certain way. I think there's very little, well, some may argue, but I think there's very, very little argument to be made that LSD, when it found its way into our society, was a transformative influence. And it had a lot to do with, I think, the counterculture and the change in perspective that people had from their experiences. And people began asking questions like, why do I need to go to Vietnam and kill people I never met? What's the point of that? Well, this is not a message the government wants you to hear, because, you're bucking the system. So I think self-empowerment, which psychedelics give you, self-empowerment to explore your own consciousness, your own spirituality, without the mediation of a therapist or a priest or a shaman, even someone who claims that, you have to be guided through this. Sometimes you do, but I think psychedelics are viewed as dangerous because they put the power back in the hands of the individual. And this goes to issues about cognitive liberty. Do we have the right to control our own consciousness? And if so, do we have the right to alter our own consciousness? My answer would be yes. As long as it doesn't harm other people, people should have that right. Whether it's with drug, there are many other techniques that alter consciousness, and people should have the right to have access to those things. That's what cognitive liberty is all about. That's a fundamental tenet of cognitive liberty.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that makes sense. Another question I've been wondering, this is a question for me, I'm just going to interject. Do you think it's possible that we could have an official psychedelic religion and all of the sort of protections that come with that?
Well, yes, I think you could. In fact, they already exist. There are, these Brazilian religions, the UDV and the Santo Daime, effectively, they already exist due to Supreme Court rulings. First with the UDV took a case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 2006, by unanimous decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the UDV and saying access to their sacrament is intrinsic to their religion. It couldn't exist without it. They have the right to this practice under the protections of religious freedom. Santo Daime, the other Brazilian cult, then they didn't have to go all the way to the Supreme Court, but they have the same protection. And now that those protections for sacramental use of ayahuasca have been codified into law, there are other organizations that have established themselves as religions and are using ayahuasca and are free to do so far. There haven't been follow-up cases because the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court pretty much put an end to the arguments. I suppose they could come back and say, well, we only meant these two Brazilian religions and these other ones are not real religions. But, you have to, so what makes it not a real religion? The government would have to establish that. So this is already happening. Myself, personally, I don't do religion. I think religions are, as I said, institutions often that, their mission is to tell you what to think. And even psychedelic religions tend to do that because they usually have a structure, they have a dogma, they have certain aspects to them. And And if you want to join the religion, if you want to take ayahuasca in the United States legally, you can join one of these religions, you know, if they'll let you in. Is that the way to go? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm inherently biased against the very idea of religion myself. So I'm probably not the person that should be commenting on this, other than, you know, well, that's how I feel about it. So we're seeing it happen. There could be religions, and there are actually in Canada, there's movements underway to get psilocybin or magic mushrooms decriminalized under what they call up here a Section 56 exemption, which is basically the right to use what would normally be a prohibited substance for specific purposes, either therapeutic or in this case spiritual, and they are granting these exemptions. So this is a necessary thing that psychedelics are going to have to go through in order to come to terms with the legal framework that they have to exist in. But you know, my feeling is the substances and the plants should not in themselves be regulated or prohibited. They should be regulated only to the extent that attention is paid to quality and purity and that sort of thing. The same criteria that would apply to any medicinal product or even any food product. They can be regulated that way, but it shouldn't be this organism or this molecule is prohibited. You know, it does not have the right to exist. I'm totally against that. You know, I don't think you can criminalize any organism.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I want to move on to a question about research chemicals and what you think about some of these new research chemicals and analogs compared to some of the more organic, natural ones. And some of the ones referenced included 5-CL-DMT and 5-bromo-DMT. Do you know much about these? And what are your thoughts on these types of drugs?
What was the first one?
5-CL-DMT. I've not heard of it. And then 5-bromo. 5-bromo-DMT? 5-bromo-DMT?
Bromo-DMT. Okay, well, I have to tell you, I don't have, I'm not really a psychonaut in the person, if a psychonaut is a person who bioassays every possible molecular variation on some of these psychedelics. If I did that, I wouldn't have any, it would be a full-time job. You know, and I'm not particularly interested in it, and I'd never get through it. I mean, I very much admire the work that Sasha Shulgin did on this, and he invented or discovered many of these compounds, but he was doing science, you know. For him, it was not a recreational thing. He made the compounds, and then he tried them on himself very carefully controlled circumstances, you know, kept careful notes, and really made a contribution, I think a significant contribution to science in the sense that he used these molecules to explore the limits of consciousness, or even the mind-body relationship. You know, take a molecule and tweak a methoxy group here and a methyl group there, extend the chain and so on, then bioassay it, see how does that change from the parent compound and the original compound, and that's useful information. I mean, I encourage scientific research. I think developing these analogs is fine, you know, but they should be used like any of these substances. They should be used carefully and thoughtfully and under the right circumstances. So you know, that's the problem, is the tendency, since they're fairly simple to make, many people do, and then they get out on the street, and if people don't know what they are, and you know, it's just another problem that we have to come to terms with, is I mean, it creates a situation where you don't really know what you're taking. This happens very often in the MDMA world. where you're thinking you think you're getting MDMA, and you're actually not. You're getting some other compound, and there's no regulation of it. There's no Food and Drug Administration or somebody to tell you, well, that's not what you think it is. There should be a mechanism for authenticating the psychedelics that you take. It would all be much simpler if these things were not illegal. If they were, there's a difference between being regulated than being illegal. Illegal, making something illegal marginalizes these things. It takes them off the table as far as opportunities for regulation are concerned. So I believe these things need some regulation. I don't think you can just hand them off on the street corner, as often happens now, or put them through vending machines. They have to come from reliable sources, so you know what you're getting, you know what the doses are, all of these issues that have to do with simply what you might call good pharmaceutical practice, rather than any moral issue. So again, did I obscure that issue, or did I clarify it?
I was muted. I think that was a good answer. There's a little deviation, but all in good form.
Okay.
What do you have thoughts on the social impacts of increased psychedelic use among the general population?
Yes, I do. I think overall, increased psychedelic use in the right circumstances and appropriately used can have tremendous beneficial effects for our society. I think it can make us more compassionate toward each other. I think it can wake us up and make us more respectful for nature, make us understand our relationship with nature, with each other, with other organisms, other sentient and non-sentient species that share this planet. I think it can have benefits for family dynamics. If we ever reach a place where you can go to one of these psychedelic centers and actually take them with your kids. I mean, that's probably a heretical thing to say, but during certain stages of life, parents and children tend to become alienated from each other and communication becomes difficult. I personally have witnessed some rather amazing what you might call acts of reconciliation and reaffirmation of love within families when they've come to ayahuasca retreats that I've organized. And the parents bring the adolescent children and they consume it together. It cements their relationship. They may have a lot of internal problems with, as tend to accumulate in families. A psychedelic, an optimized set and setting, optimized doses of the medicine and so on can be tremendously healing for families. And I think that they also make us aware of our commonality, our common human nature. And this is a problem that we have right now in our society. It's a very divisive society right now, and in part because of our political leaders. Our political leaders do not provide an example. They provide an example of how not to do it, like no opportunity to stigmatize another group or point at someone and insult someone who is not like you. Either they don't look like you or they don't think like you or whatever. No opportunity to do that is passed up. I think this is tearing society apart. And I think that psychedelics, we know that they're the medicine. That we know that in a sense they can be very important in healing our society, but you have to create opportunities where that can happen. You have to integrate them into society so that again, their benefits can be maximized. And so I think overall, I think it will lead to a more intelligent and compassionate society, and a more awake society, and a society that is more attuned to the fact that it is immersed in nature. It doesn't own nature. It's nature does not exist for it to exploit. And I think we're getting a strong message from COVID, from the COVID pandemic, that we have to rethink our perspective. I mean, COVID is a message to our species as well. A not so gentle reminder that we're not running the show. And this is what psychedelics always remind us of, that we're not running the show. And the other thing is, we are all one. I mean, we are more like each other than we are different. So we need to kind of bring that to the front and suppress or push into the background all the forces that keep us separated and afraid of each other, basically.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So I'm getting the impression that you're really not into religion based on the previous comments, but that there's sort of this aspect of psychedelics that helps us connect and whatnot. And so I'm curious, there was a comment wondering that it sounds like you've gotten very scientific and maybe more into empirical design and kind of having evidence-based research for various claims, yet you have a lot of roots in the field of ayahuasca and the notion of plant teachers, which kind of seems more metaphysical and more spiritual. So can you comment on sort of the interplay between kind of the scientific and the spiritual worlds that you're kind of navigating, and whether you find yourself to be leaning more towards one or the other side?
Well, if you guys didn't ask such deep questions, I wouldn't have to give such long answers. Just say it, I mean, I'm happy to try with that, but that's why I keep giving these long answers, because it's multiple, these are multi-layered questions, right? And I think psychedelics are, again, unique because they bring reductionist science, they bring science and spirituality together. And that's something that's not happened before. Psychedelics force science in some way to acknowledge that the spirit, that we have a spiritual nature, and spirituality is a real thing. It's part of the dynamic of our existence. This is why Roland Griffiths and his people can design experiments in the best, implement the best practices of reductionist science to look at something like mystical experiences. So mystical experiences must be a real thing because they can study it. Not only can they study it, they can reliably induce a mystical experience with, 25 milligrams of psilocybin in the right set and setting pretty much will let anyone have a mystical experience. So, there's never been a tool like this before to study what we would attribute to spirituality. And spirituality is, again, an aspect of human behavior and human experience. We can now use these psychedelics as essentially pharmacological probes to link experience with what's going on in the brain. You can give someone a psilocybin and induce a psychedelic mystical experience. You can open a window on their brain while it's happening using fMRI and that sort of thing. You can actually see what parts of the brain are involved in this, which parts are activated, which parts are suppressed. So I think that psychedelics, again, are a transformational tool for science, because before they just didn't deal with this. Organisms were complex machines. Medicine exorcised the spirit out of itself around the turn of the 19th century. And it all started actually with the isolation of morphine from opium poppies, because morphine Before that, there was an idea that there was a life force, there was some mysterious energy or life force that inhabited living things. And, you know, the medicinal properties of plants were understood in those terms, energetics and that sort of thing. But the Surgeoner, the pharmacist who isolated morphine for the first time in a pure form and showed that it had pretty much the same properties as the opium poppy. In other words, it caused euphoria, it relieved pain, eventually it led to addiction and that sort of thing. But it clearly was not alive, right? Morphine is a crystal. It's not a living thing, but it has these properties. So that was the reductionist, that was the reductionist sort of realization. And then medicine ever since has had the mission to exorcise spirit out of medicine, that, we're just complex machines. You apply the right molecular monkey wrench and you can fix the machine. But we're not automobiles in a body shop. We're living beings, so it's not quite that easy. And I think psychedelics have forced us to take another look at this issue of spirituality and just what is consciousness and what are what is our relationship with the wider cosmos and this sort of thing. So they're very useful tools in this respect. And I think somewhere in that question there was a reference to plant teachers.
Yes.
And plant teachers, are an indigenous concept, but it's not an anti-scientific concept, really. I don't think of it that way. I mean, you learn from these plants. Therefore they're teachers. They don't have to be sentient entities to be teachers. I might read a book and learn from that book. So that book is a teacher. Anything you learn from teaches you. So you can, in this respectful way, you can say, well, these are plant teachers. Yeah, they teach me. That doesn't mean that I regard them as sentient entities like, some people prefer that perspective. I don't really follow that, but it doesn't matter. Other people have said, well, what about the revelations, the insights that you acquire, that you get from these things? That, is this coming from some wise entity that the psychedelic just puts you in touch with, or is it coming from some part of our own mind? And it's just presenting as though it were not part of ourself. I don't think we can really know, but in a sense, I don't think it really matters, because the question is the information good? Does it seem to be valid? And whether it came from a part of myself that I can only contact on a psychedelic, or whether it came from the teacher itself, the organism or the drug itself, it doesn't really matter. Is the information good? That's the question.
Yeah, that's a good point. As you were saying that, it was making me think of kind of a couple questions that have come in that maybe kind of we can all address into one question related to, so you're saying that sometimes there's this concern when you have a sort of a spiritual component to a drug, and then when Western medicine gets a hold of it and they want to take the spirit out and ramp it up and mass produce it. But that's kind of like been the history of how drug development works, is they find something in nature, they extract it, they mass produce it. And I know that with psilocybin, so, now we have, there's labs now that can make psilocybin, with yeast, and you don't have to grow them from the mushrooms anymore. And then there's, the companies like Usona and Compass that are making synthetic psilocybin for the clinical trials. And I've heard this anecdote that I'm not sure if it's true, that when Albert Hoffman first extracted psilocybin and sent it to Maria Sabina, I think, and she tried it and thought it still had the spirit. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at with, the teacher is maybe something that awakens in yourself, that it kind of initiates with the compound. You don't necessarily need this metaphysical spirit from the plant. So because I know there's
Well,
that concern with ayahuasca and like pharmahuasca, you know, are you losing something when you try to pharmaceuticalize it like that? But then it could benefit so many more people if we do pharmaceuticalize it. So maybe you can comment on that.
yes. I think you do lose something when you pharmaceuticalize one of these things. You lose, at least unless you take extraordinary steps to keep in mind where this really came from. It's easy to forget when you're applying the drug in a clinical situation. Maria Sabina, when she took Hoffman's psilocybin, said, "The spirit of the mushroom is in the pill." You know, and for her, that was her experience. That was her subjective experience. You know, and I think that that was legitimate. You know, for her, again, you know, this comes back to this, what we were talking about earlier, the difference between the drug, which is simply a molecule that has certain properties. In the case of psilocybin, it's a strong 5-HT2A and 1A agonist. And, you know, we pretty much understand the mechanism by which it works. And we can watch this process from the outside using fMRI and these other neuroimaging technologies. What we can't do yet, and what we haven't been able to do, although this may be a goal for neuroscience, we can't relate what we subjectively experience. You know, we can't take those hallucinations, those revelations and so on, and project them onto a screen somewhere. So with neuroscience, the inherent limitation of studying psychedelics is you're always going to be looking at this from the outside. If you want to measure and quantify it, you can take the psychedelic, you can have the internal experience, but it seems like that's inherently not quantifiable, not measurable in the same way that, you know, we can measure all these external parameters. So, you know, it seems to me that, you know, well, I guess that's my point, that you cannot, you know, there's a tendency to project onto the drug properties that don't belong to the drug. You know, the drug does certain things, and when it cycles in your body, certain things happen. You're making the trip. The trip is not in the drug. You know, the trip, and it's a mistake that people tend to make. It's a mistake that Terence and I made at La Chorrera in a certain way. But you have to remember, the drug is simply a catalyst. It's a key that fits into a lock of certain receptors, and as it metabolizes through the body, as it goes through what you might call its pharmacokinetic symphony, as it works its way through the body and the brain, and it's like listening to a symphony. You can't listen to a symphony if you have a piece of music on a, you know, written down on a piece of paper. Not until you play that music can you experience what the music is about. Psychedelics are the same way. Sitting on a shelf, a crystalline substance, no, they're there, they're not so interesting. You have to put them in a complex nervous system, and then interesting things begin to happen. So the metaphysical part, the experiential part, that comes from within us. You know, it's not the drug that contains the trip. The drug unlocks the trip that's already inside of us that we're able to experience. You know, I think something Rick Doblin said. Rick Doblin has said many interesting things, but something that he said in the film Neurons to Nirvana really stuck with me. He said, people do not take psychedelics to have psychedelic experiences. They take psychedelics to have human experiences. And I think that's an important thing to, an important difference to note. So does that make any sense? I mean, the question is way back there, but that's my answer, if we can remember what the question was.
Yeah, I thought that made sense. Thanks. The question was about, you know, kind of taking spirit out of the compound, but I think you answered that pretty well. Next question. Do you have a preferred ritual prior to your experiences? And what is your preferred set and setting? And I guess along those lines, what's your preferred psychedelic?
Well, most of my my own personal experiences is either with mushrooms or ayahuasca. And usually when I take ayahuasca, I take it in a group setting with a shaman or a curandero or a facilitator of some kind. Uh, and and that's just the way I like to experience it. You know, that's the structure that I like, the vessel that I like to create in which the experience can unfold. You know, I often say, you know, ayahuasca is a liquid. It will fill any vessel you create for it. And that's kind of what you're doing when you're optimizing a set and setting. You know, it's you're creating an optimal environment in which you can let this experience unfold. You know, primarily, number one, it has to be an environment where you feel safe and not threatened, an environment where maybe or maybe not there's someone to look after real world issues, maybe even give you a lifeline to reality, just remind you occasionally that you've taken a drug and that's why all these strange things are happening. It's not required. You know, some people are fine with these altered states. They don't need that reassurance. But the important thing is the set and setting is, number one, safe, and number two, supportive of whatever the experience you want to unfold. So it might go to your choice of music. It might go to what you choose to have in your environment, maybe some books to look at or pieces of art, or, you know, it's how you structure the setting to optimize the effect. So that is, that's an important thing. And because I take ayahuasca, I'm usually in one of those ritual settings. With mushrooms, I make less effort I often don't do it in a group. I might do it either by myself or with one or two friends. And so I don't pay so much attention to ritual. You know, maybe I should. But as long as there's a structure around it, then the experience can unfold, you know, in its own way. It can manifest in its own way. Now, my brother insisted that, you know, if you're going to take psilocybin, it had to be 5 dried grams in absolute darkness. Well, you know, that's one approach, and that's fine. You're likely to learn a lot if you do that, but that's not the only approach. It's certainly not there's no requirement. Nobody is telling you you have to do this, you know. So it's a combination of what's appropriate for the taking of the medicine and what your own preferences are. I think the most important thing is that these medicines should be respected, and they should be approached thoughtfully, so that, you know, I mean, the research has shown that a high dose psilocybin experience can be among the most meaningful experiences of a person's life. You know, the Roland Griffith's work has shown this, and he often talks about this. So if you're going to deliberately undertake something that might be the most meaningful experience of your life, you don't want to do it casually. You know, you want to optimize the conditions, and you probably don't want to do it, you know, even that often. You know, some people take a psychedelic a few times in a lifetime. Maybe that's all they need, you know, because these are life changing. Other people, maybe people like me and some in this group, maybe we're thick-skulled. Maybe we don't get the message so easily, and we have to keep going back to the well and drinking. You know, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Well said. I'm wondering, there's been some questions wondering about your experiences with Terrence at La Chirera. I know that was kind of an intense experience. Was there anything that you drew from that helps kind of inform your own set and setting, or any words of wisdom or cautionary tales from that could help with kind of having a good set and setting?
Well, again, a difficult, yeah, I think a lot of what we learned from the experiment, as it's called, it's really shouldn't be called the experience. I think one of the big take-home lessons from that is uh, keep your skeptical antennas well deployed. You know, particularly with psychedelics, there's a temptation to you know, give in to delusions. You know, sometimes the message that you're getting from psychedelics, they seem to be so powerful. They seem to be weighted with so much meaning that you just accept them. You know, and the skeptic function that we carry around with us most of the time, hopefully, is disabled temporarily. And that's okay, because the skeptic function is part of this default mode network that is now the buzzword in psychedelic neuroscience. It's a lot of what the default mode network do. It's a mechanism for excluding information, for blocking information that is not useful to your immediate survival. Psychedelics temporarily disable that, so more information can come in, and you get funny ideas, sometimes really, really, really peculiar ideas. And funny ideas are great because often they have, you know, they're useful, they have some merit. It's important, though, to keep your skeptical powder dry, if you will, as you review these ideas. Before you act on anything, look at it the next day. Look at it in the cold light after the trip is over. Turn that idea around in your mind and think, well, did this have any validity, or was it just a crazy, appealing, but ultimately not true? Or I mean, not that truth is necessarily the criteria, but you know, you have to be cautious, just accepting the messages that you get, because you know, you have to trust yourself. You can't necessarily trust the message that you may sense is coming from the medicine or some other source. It's really coming from you, you know. But it creates an occasion to look at what's coming from you in a way that you've never actually looked at before. So you know, that's what I would say. It's important to keep this this line open to what we'll provisionally call the consensus reality. You know, even though we know that that itself is a hallucination.
Well, thank you for answering that. This might be a little bit more on the personal level, but perhaps something to touch on, especially since you just did your tribute to Terence. But what's your fondest memory of Terence?
Gosh, my fondest memory of Terence. Well, no, I mean, we shared some rich times together, and you know, he was in my life for all of my life, and most of his, you know, 50 years. You know, my fondest memory, if I'd have to say, it's not a single memory, but one of, you know, some of our most pleasant times together were spent when he was in the Tussman program in Berkeley. And he had an upstairs loft in this place on Tunnel Road. And when I would visit, he was a real aficionado of hashish. And we used to enjoy sitting around in that loft and smoking hash for hours and just talking about whatever came up, you know. And essentially it became a process of dialoguing, trying different ideas out on each other. That was, those were very rich times, you know. I cherish those very much. You know, Terence, you know, effectively what he used to do as a student was to gather people around him and hold salons, you know, and he would get people so loaded on cannabis that they couldn't speak. So then they were speechless, and cannabis made him even more voluble and more able to speak. And that's right where he wanted them. So then he could just rave on, you know, and hold forth, and everyone was hanging on to every word. So then he actually made a career out of that. And those were some very rich times, some of those group sessions where we just be passing around the pipe. Everybody else is, you know, practically unable to move, let alone speak. And Terence is just raving on. Well, we had experiences like that with just the two of us, you know, and those were very rich experiences.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Let's see, how much does, so we know that like diet is really important for ayahuasca, but is diet important for the use of other psychedelics as well?
I think possibly they are. The diet certainly is emphasized in ayahuasca, and it's emphasized more for people that are training to become ayahuasqueros. You know, they talk about the dieta, which is taking a certain medicinal plant, not necessarily ayahuasca, to learn about its properties. And then you diet with the plant, and then you, in so doing, you take its power into yourself. And then you can, you know, the knowledge that's imparted, you can use in the application of that plant for healing. And you know, this is kind of the cultural context of the dieta. Other traditions may have similar, you know, requirements for dietas, but I think it's mostly a cultural thing. You know, the expectations are a cultural thing, except maybe in the case of ayahuasca, because it's a combination of two plants, at least two plants, one of which contains the MAO inhibitors. There may be some dietary issues. You want to avoid taking certain plants that might interact with MAO inhibitors. And you know, that's how we would see it as Westerners. That's not how the curanderos or the shamans have seen it. They just, through practical experience, they've learned that certain plants should be avoided. You know, they're not telling themselves, well, it's interacting with an MAO inhibitor. They don't really have that conceptual framework, and you know, their own is different. But yeah, usually there are dietary practices with many of these things, but probably ayahuasca is where that's emphasized more than other things.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I think there was like a follow-up question that seemed relevant. I'll try to find it in a minute. There's been quite a few questions about psychedelic use for minors. Like I know we touched upon kind of use in more ritual settings in some of the Amazonian cultures and maybe some other Native American cultures. What do you think about psychedelic use in an adolescent brain? You know, like ketamine's being used right now for depression, or should this be something that's part of a rite of passage for teenagers? Or, you know, what do you think about that?
Should psychedelics be a rite of passage for teenagers?
Or should psychedelics, like how should our society approach having adolescents get access to psychedelics?
Well, again, I think intelligently. You know, I don't think we should make arbitrary rules that, well, you know, you're under 16, so you shouldn't have access to psychedelics. It should be approached in I mean, you can't make these hard and fast rules, you know, and particularly with teenagers and adolescents. If they want access to psychedelics, I can assure you they will find psychedelics, you know. So the proper approach is to not say that below a certain age you shouldn't take a psychedelic, because there's a great range of maturity in every individual, and some people probably mature enough to handle a psychedelic maybe at age 10 or 11. Others are not mature enough to handle a psychedelic at age 50. So it's all about an individual thing. As a general rule, I wouldn't recommend that people, age 10 or 11 should take a psychedelic, but it does happen in traditional cultures, and there's really not a lot of sign that that's particularly harmful. I have seen children that, in traditional societies that use psychedelics, they're present in the ceremonies, and they may take it, they may take less than usual. But again, it's one of these things where hard and fast rules don't really address the problem, and we have to be careful about making these, laying down these rules unless they're thoughtfully crafted. Just because in our society the notion of a young teenager taking a psychedelic is shocking or abhorrent to us, that's a cultural assumption. It's not necessarily true. People should take psychedelics under the right guidance. I wouldn't recommend young people go off and experiment with these things on their own below a certain age. But in traditional societies, this doesn't happen. The kids don't take ayahuasca off and party with it. It just doesn't go on. They have a different mind. They would never think of it. It would be absolutely the worst thing you could do. So it depends on culture. It depends on, making a practical assessment on a case-by-case individual situation. Is this person capable and ready to have a psychedelic experience with the right guidance? Forget what the age is. That's with certain lower limits, I guess. I wouldn't be giving it to 10 or 11 years old, at least not on a regular basis. But it's not that necessarily any harm is going to result from that.
That's a good point. Thank you for addressing all of that. I really appreciate that. I think we've got a lot of parents in our group, and kind of how do parents that like psychedelics talk about psychedelics with their kids, and
well, the important thing is to talk about them. Yeah. With respect to any of these things, that's the whole thing. We were talking about drug education. You have to be able to talk to your kids in an honest way about substances and substance use, and it's not confined to psychedelics. The same conversation needs to happen about alcohol and tobacco and any of the myriad psychoactive drugs. We are immersed in a chemical ecology. So clear communication and no bullshit communication is what needs to happen. And children are not stupid. They can tell if they're being lied to, so why not just communicate honestly? That's my idea. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, I agree.
Didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, it's okay.
Yeah, this is a knotty issue. It's a tough issue, but it should be discussed.
Yeah, I think it's a great topic. It's one, we've thought about having a psychedelic parenting group, for people that have kids in the community. How do they deal with that? We had somebody at our community symposium last year from Madison Psychedelic Society talk. She actually goes to high schools and educates them about psychedelics because she was one of the participants in the UW pharmacokinetic study. So it's kind of an interesting perspective of it's like sex education, just give them the right information. They're going to do it anyway. Let's just keep them doing it safe. But I did LSD when I was 15, but it was, sketchy and it probably wasn't good quality. But if I had it in some sort of ceremonial context where I had a psychedelic elder or something to kind of help coach me on what to do with that kind of experience, because it really was very unremarkable at that age because I didn't have a whole lot of consciousness to explore, at 15. So it'd be interesting to see how that moves
Yeah.
forward and how parents deal with it.
Yeah.
So I want to move on to
Many of the same considerations that apply to psychedelic education apply to sex education.
right.
You know, this is why sex education is also, like drug education, largely a joke, you know, because the message is abstinence. Well, you know, tell that to a bunch of horny teenagers. I mean, they're not going to accept that message. So why not give them real information? If they're going to be sexually active, here's what you can do to minimize the harm and maximize the benefit. Same with drugs. If you're going to use drugs, realize that you're entering into a relationship with these substances, and use them in a way that's thoughtful and minimize the harm and maximize the benefit. It's not such a complicated message.
Yeah. All right, well, I want to move on because we've got about 15 minutes left. So this question is related to kind of your time here in Minnesota. So how did you get involved with your work at the University of Minnesota, and what kind of work did you carry out there?
How did I get involved, and what kind of work did I
do at University of Minnesota?
Well, I was a teacher at the University of Minnesota. I joined the Center for Spirituality and Healing, and I think it was 2001 or 2002, and I kind of stumbled into it. I met the director of the program, Mary Jo Kreitzer, at a business meeting with actually Horst Reichelbacher, who I used to work for Vedas, so he was my former boss. I met Mary Jo at some meeting that he was having that I happened to be present, and she mentioned that she needed someone to teach ethnobotany. And at the time, this was shortly after my brother died. I had been a consultant for many years, but when my brother died, or got sick, I kind of gave all that up so I could be with him. So I was looking for work, and she mentioned that she was looking for someone to teach ethnobotany. And as it happened, I had just completed a big tome about herbal medicines. It was called Botanical Medicines, the desk reference for major herbal supplements. You can still buy it, but it's way out of date. Anyway, I had finished that book, and I was able to show her an early draft of that book, and she said, "Well, you interested in teaching ethnobotany?" And at the time, I was like, "What am I going to do? All my consulting has dried up." So I said, "Sure, I'm interested in doing that." And eventually, I persuaded her that it shouldn't be ethnobotany. Let's call it ethnopharmacology. So I came to the university and I taught first course I taught was People, Plants, and Drugs, Introduction to Ethnopharmacology. And then I developed another course called Botanical Medicines in Healthcare, which was a much more buttoned down kind of conventional course. As you can imagine, the ethnopharmacology course was pretty wild and woolly. I even taught a course at the Center for Spirituality and Healing one semester in, I think, 2006. I proposed a course titled Culture, Drugs, and Society. And the way it works is, if you want to teach a new course, they let you you submit a syllabus, and then they let you teach the course. You're sort of on probation. You know, if you teach the course one semester and they approve it, then it gets its own course number, and then you can teach the course. Well, they didn't like this course that I had created, the Culture, Drugs, and Society. It stepped on a number of toes, and they were not happy with it. The students who took it loved it. They thought it was one of the most valuable courses they've ever taken. I think Brian was one of those, and very interesting when in the first sessions of that course, the first class meeting, I went around and basically I said, "So why are you taking this course? You know, you're interested in drugs, obviously. What motivated you to take this course?" so many of those people told me, well, I first, got interested in drug when I took DARE, the DARE course at, I think at the 6th grade. That was the first attempt for drug education. And a lot of people said I first became curious about drugs. I didn't know anything about drugs. Then I took DARE and I thought, wow, these things are pretty interesting. So DARE had the opposite effect. It stimulated curiosity about drugs. And it was actually a wonderful course. I thought it was, because it was iconoclastic. And it was not confined to psychedelics at all. We talked about the whole spectrum kind of the use of psychopharmaceuticals, about the use of things like Adderall and other medicines to, chemically engineer personalities. I think Brian would agree it was a pretty good course. And I was disappointed when they would not let me teach it again. And they gave completely lame excuses as to why I couldn't teach it again. But anyway, they didn't, it was too much of a political hot potato. And the Center for Spirituality had some, they have donors, right? And some of those donors are conservative, quite conservative. So they probably thought this would hurt, this would not look good to their donor base. Not that I cared about that, but they cared very much about that. So that's how I got involved. And then as that was 2008. Before that, I developed an intersession course called Plants and Human Affairs that we used to teach in Hawaii in the intersessions, in the January intersessions. And I taught those with my my sister-in-law, actually. She was at the time, or she was Kat Harrison, who is herself an ethnobotanist. So we co-taught this course in Hawaii, this 2-week intensive. And it was also a great course. It was great fun. And it was intensive. We were all in this kind of shabby B&B. And so the students and the faculty and other teachers were together all the time. So the discussions went on pretty much 24/7. And then we had the Hawaiian environment, which is a wonderful natural laboratory to learn about medicinal plants of all kinds. And so that was basically what I did with the university.
Did you ever try to do any psychedelic research there?
No, really not. I had conversations about trying to apply for an IND to study ayahuasca, and it never really went beyond the discussion stage. What I did do there that was research oriented was I got a grant in 2004 from the Stanley Medical Research Institute, which supports research on schizophrenia. And I got a grant to look for plants in the Amazon, ethnomedical plants that might be used to treat schizophrenia or cognitive deficits like dementias and cognitive impairment. So that was the only real research-oriented activities I had at the University of Minnesota. I was peripherally involved with a couple of grants researching the anti-cancer activities of turkey tail mushrooms, but I was not the PI or anything like that on that grant. So that's my checkered history with the University of Minnesota.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful, at least for me, as I embark on my psychedelic research journey at the University of Minnesota.
Right. No, you're the pioneer, Jessica. You're the first I know of that's actually been able to do it. So good for you. And you have the departmental affiliation and all that to do it. The Center for Spirituality and Healing was not really a department, so they were limited in some ways. But I loved my experience there. It made me understand how much I enjoy teaching. which I
Mhm.
never really had the chance to do on a regular basis before that. So it was valuable for me.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe we'll close out with some visions towards the future. And so you've got this McKenna Academy set up, and so you're hosting
Mhm.
obviously some online events and whatnot. And not sure if you have any plans for a center down in the Amazon, but what do you envision as the sort of the future of the McKenna Academy moving forward?
Well, the McKenna Academy is, yeah, because of COVID and all that, we've had to really start doing a lot of virtual things. And, you know, like the tribute to series that we had. Originally, that was going to be a conference in San Francisco, you know, and in collaboration with the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. It was going to have a much broader scope than just a tribute to Terence, but we were not able to do that. So then we decided to do that tribute. We're going to try to develop a strong online presence and do virtual conferences and events like this and all kinds of things that you can do online. And I think we're all getting a renewed appreciation for the potential of this kind of technology, Zoom and Crowdcast and all that. You can reach a much larger demographic than you can from any physical conference. And you don't even have to move out of your basement. You know, they can do it all from home. There's good things and bad things about that, because I think personal contact is important. But the McKenna Academy also has aspirations to, at some point, establish a physical center, probably in the Sacred Valley, where people can come for retreats and education and conferences and other types of educational activities. It's not solely about psychedelics. It's called the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. Natural philosophy is a sort of open-handed approach to understanding the cosmos and our place in it. You know, natural philosophy is the precursor of science, before the predecessor of science, before science became reductionist and preoccupied with quantitation and all that. This exorcism of the spirit out of science that we refer to later. You know, natural philosophy admits that there are other ways of knowing. You know, reductionism and scientific measurement is not the only legitimate way to understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. So that's what the Academy is all about. I think of it as a psychedelic university, the first psychedelic university since Eleusis. Eleusis was sacked and burned by the Goths in 396 AD. And that was the last of the Mediterranean mystery schools, which were basically psychedelic mystery schools. We aspire to resurrect that tradition in the McKenna Academy. We're creating a kind of a mystery school. And hopefully that will be successful.
So what kind of classes do you think you'll teach at the mystery school?
Well, whatever comes up, you know, whatever we're interested in. You know, for example, we did this tribute to Terence just because the opportunity presented itself. But I would like to do many other types of conferences, and either in physical locations or online. For example, I want to get Graham Hancock to come and give a presentation on his work, either in South America, which would be fantastic. If we can't do it in South America, maybe we can do it online. So things like that, or this book on fungi that Merlin Sheldrake just came out with. I'm working on him to agree to turn that into essentially an online course, a course where he could, you know, each class could be about a different major topic that he covers in this book. There's plenty of material for that. So we want to foster interesting conferences, hopefully impactful conferences. We want to bring brilliant minds there and discuss all of these things. I guess the if the historical roots of the academy is Eleusis, then maybe the modern analogy is Esalen or someplace like that. Essentially, a place of learning and sharing ideas, learning from brilliant people and learning from each other. And as I sometimes say, tongue in cheek, but in some ways not really that tongue in cheek, I say this may be the first university where all the faculty members are not necessarily human.
That's interesting. I like that. So you will have plant teachers on your faculty?
Absolutely, we'll have plant teachers on the faculty.
That's great. Well, it looks like we're about out of time. Thank you everyone for joining and submitting such wonderful questions. And thank you so much, Dennis, for doing our Ask a Psychedelic Scientist. It's been really fun and good to see your face again.
Good to see you all again, the ones I know. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Right.
Sorry for my rambling, disjointed answers. That's just the way I roll. But hopefully there's nuggets of information in there that you can relate to. So
absolutely, it was perfect, Dennis. We love you just the way you are.
Okay.
Okay.
I love you too.
All right. Bye. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.